Very much. I would now like to welcome my next guest into the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. We have a very special guest here who knows a lot about the education world, and since the announcement by the state's education department of moving from Park to a more Massachusetts-based model, wanted to pick her brain. Dr. Sandra Stotsky, thank you so much for coming in today. I very much appreciate it.
For inviting me.
You know a lot about assessments. You know a lot about Park. Former Senior Associate Commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education, Professor Emerita in the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. Biography a mile long. You know so much about assessments and where things stand. When you heard that Rhode Island, having been based in the Park system and knowing where folks feel about Park here, was looking at the Massachusetts model and made the announcement, I reached out to you and you had a number of questions about what this looks like, and tomorrow we'll actually have Education Commissioner Dr. Wagner in to talk about this, but lots of folks are talking about what this might actually mean. So maybe we'll start with some broad brushstrokes.
Sure.
And talk to us, what should folks be paying attention to as this move is being made?
There are a lot of things for parents to be concerned about in particular, but also teachers and school administrators. They should, for one thing, be interested in what's going to happen to all the writing. Where is it being corrected? Is it computer-based writing that's going to be corrected by a computer, or will Rhode Island's own English teachers be correcting some of that writing, as we did in Massachusetts with the original MCAS, which I would call the good MCAS.
So you wanted to point out to folks there is a big difference between the original MCAS and, as you said, MCAS 2.0.
Yes. What seems to be the case, because that's all I can figure out from what I've read, is that Rhode Island is going to be using MCAS 2.0, which was a so-called compromise that the Board of Education in Massachusetts in November 2015 agreed to, because as in Rhode Island, a lot of parents and teachers and others didn't like Park. So they wanted to get rid of the Park label for their test. They agreed to call it MCAS 2.0 because the MCAS test that I had been involved with when I was in the department around the year 2000 was a good test that very few people had any problems with, and it was based on first-class standards, and that goes together with the kind of MCAS 2.0, unfortunately, that you're now going to be having in Rhode Island. It goes with Common Core standards and in effect locks them in, which is part of the intention, and it also shores up to some extent Park's financial base because it's been having financial problems. So if it gets Rhode Island and a few other states to say that kids have got to pass Park tests in order to graduate and get a high school diploma, then it locks it in and gives Park a more stable financial future. What it does for your kids is a whole other ballgame, and I'll let you get in with your next question.
But I do want to go back to Park. Let's talk about, I don't necessarily want to go back to the beginning, but why was Park so unpopular?
There are several reasons why the Common Core base tests, both of them, have been unpopular. The other one, Smarter Balanced, has the acronym of SBAC,
okay.
SBAC. So if I use it, you'll know what I'm talking about. But both of them involved a lot more testing than the old state tests that were required did. They were much longer. They've been shortened because of parent pressure. And they have what even test developers see as peculiar test items on them. And I looked at some of the sample items for what's going to be in Rhode Island. That was a link in the PR that your own commissioner released last week or so, I guess. And the passages are very easy. I looked particularly at grade 8 because if kids can't read high school level material, by the end of grade 8. They're not going to do very well in high school unless you dumb down the grading system in high school to make sure they can pass their high school subjects. So I saw 3 sample items. The third, which was, they were all stories. The third one had a so-called essay to be based on it, but it was 6 short paragraphs. That was it. It was about principles, P-L-E-S at the end, versus principles, P-A-L-S at the end, and 6 short paragraphs, and the writing has to be based on whatever is in those 6 short paragraphs. Mm-hmm. That's not good enough for authentic high school work. But if that's what your commissioner and your Rhode Island staff at the Department of Education think is good enough, high enough for Rhode Island kids, then parents are going to have to figure out ways to get their English classes beefed up.
Okay, I'm going to move you a little bit closer over here as we're getting you out of range. The rigor of them, would you say not as rigorous?
They're not rigorous, let me put it that way. I would not call upper elementary level writing passages that have been chosen rigorous. Now, that is the word that parrots go around chirping
use too often.
Every time you see Common Core mentioned, they will talk about rigorous standards. Well, they are far from rigorous. The original MCAS was based on more rigorous standards and had passages at the high school level, grade 8 and 10, chosen by English teachers. I don't know who chose the ones for Park. We don't know. There's nothing there that says who chose them, and we don't know where a cut score or pass-fail score is going to be. So it's like a pig in a poke.
I've got me here, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to talk with
You ask them.
Dr. Wagner tomorrow. These are the questions that you raise that you think that the department should be pointing out. But before I get to those, let's talk about families deciding to opt out of the testing. There's been a vociferous group of folks here in Rhode Island that are very vehement that if they don't like it, that they are entitled to pull their child out.
They have the right to. Actually, they have a right to. They don't have to have permission. There doesn't have to be a law that says they can do it if they want. They have a right as parents. Parents have always had the right to keep their kids at home if they were sick, they wanted to take them somewhere or do something. So this is a right parents have. And the state plan, which I'm not going to go into the details for here, but you have one, it's called the Rhode Island State Plan, hasn't been submitted to USED, the United States Department of Education's own peer reviewers who will look at it. That plan is going to say something about the kind of standards and tests you have to use. And they're going to be as dumbed down as MCAS 2.0 high school level.
So when does this plan have to be submitted? Again, if I have Dr. Wagner in, is this something that has to be done in a regular...
Anytime until before September.
Okay, so ask him about that.
Only a few have so far, about a dozen have been submitted because it started in April. The Obama administration had wanted all of them by April, but the incoming Betsy DeVos administration for the Department of Ed has sort of pushed back the time.
Let's talk again. I see the questions and I can't wait to pick your brain about them, but you did just raise an interesting subject that I want to discuss with you. Your thoughts?
Her concern seems to be charter schools. I don't know if Rhode Island wants more charter schools than it now has. The evidence for their effectiveness is sort of equivocal at this point, but the basic problem is what you do with all the kids in your public schools, because there are still more in your public schools than will be in charter schools, as in Massachusetts, for a good long time. So the USED is going to be promoting, so far as I can tell, I don't have any inside pipeline to it, as far as I can tell, it's promoting what it calls school choice. But school choice of what? Schools that still have to teach to Common Core standards and get Common Core based tests which will be in Rhode Island, MCAS 2.0.
MCAS 2.0, and things that you want to know from the commissioner when we have him in tomorrow. Per your email, says Dr. Stotsky, I need to know the test specs for both the planned Rhode Island test and whatever portion of MCAS 2.0 is being used. How many multiple choice questions will be at each tested grade level? So let's start with that. Why should we be paying attention to multiple choice?
You want to find out what the format is at each grade level. How many questions are there? First of all, how long will the test be? And I believe it's been shortened because parents have been complaining for so many years about the tests aligned to Common Core that the message finally got through that they had to make the test shorter. So finding out how many questions are on it, finding out who grades the writing. The original 4 open response pieces of writing at every grade level. They were wonderful. They were corrected by our teachers, and they were corrected for content as well as for conventions. I don't think you have any. So far, there's almost no information of this. Raises another set of questions. How come? Why don't you have a lot more information available for parents, of all things?
So what should we be asking if it's not going to be teachers grading it? Who's grading it, where it's being graded, on which standards is it being graded?
How do computers grade it? How do they grade for content? Well, they can't, literally. So you have a problem. Who approved it? Why can't Rhode Island parents, why can't Rhode Island experts in mathematics and in English language arts, literary scholars, you have plenty of them in Rhode Island, why can't they vet these test items before they're given to Rhode Island children who are supposed to be made college and career ready, and then many of them go on to Rhode Island colleges? So wouldn't it be logical that experts here in Rhode Island have a chance to look particularly at whatever is done in the name of the grade 10 or 11 test, because it looks like from the PR that the SAT is going to be used for the grade 10 or 11 test. Now, the SAT has been dumbed down to Common Core standards. It's not now an independent predictive test of college readiness as it was for many years. That test has been changed. But what the test items are? Anybody's guess. But why not have the experts in your own state look at them?
You talk about experts here in Rhode Island. We're always consistently looking to Massachusetts as a better example of public education.
We didn't have our own experts looking at them either. We couldn't get them. So why are we all buying a pig in a poke? We're not the only states.
Do you think it's getting more regionalized? You know, there's this question here of if the decision's made to look at the MCAS, to adopt the MCAS standards. I've heard some folks that have concerns, well, is it becoming a broader sort of control over education and testing and not being brought down to the local level where it has always been?
That's been one of the basic problems for anything to do with the Common Core project since 2010. And you should know that I was on the Common Core Validation Committee, among all the other things I've done. That was what I was doing from 2009. And we were there to make sure that Common Core standards were research-based, internationally benchmarked, and rigorous. And the one mathematician on that Common Core Validation Committee, Jim Milgram, who's a mathematician at Stanford, and I was the only K-12 English language arts expert. We both said that Common Core standards were not researchally comparable or rigorous. But nobody seems to care because control, this gets to your question, national control of all states, all children seems to be the goal. Now, equal outcomes is not anything anyone voted for, but that's what seems to be there to close gaps. Equal outcomes is simply a euphemism for closing gaps. And gaps between whom? We don't know. They don't even tell us who the gaps are being closed between. And why we should vote for closing of gaps. And how do you close gaps? Do you lower the top 50% down, raise the bottom a little bit, and then say the gaps are now closed? And everyone's college and career ready? Or do you decide that most everyone is not college and career ready, and only those few kids who go to private schools that are not Common Core go on to college? And that's where the role of the Gates Foundation becomes very problematic. His kids go to a non-Common Core private school.
Do you think that that's a little disingenuous then if there is involvement in public education, Common Core-based public education?
It sure raises questions about hypocrisy. Arnie Duncan, too. He moves back to Chicago, and his kids are, I've been told, at the University of Chicago Lab School, not a Common Core school. So here are these policymakers or funders making sure that other people's kids are in Common Core schools, but their kids are in academically demanding schools. Oh, it's really hypocrisy at the highest level. But where do policymakers talk about that or even show that they care? I don't know that we've heard anything like that here.
So I've got one more test-based question before we get to a more broader one. And this was an interesting point that we'll have to ask the commissioner. You said you were puzzled by this following blurb and the release about the change of test. Up to 15 additional points for unscored questions can be awarded to your score by your test. The maximum possible points for this test is 23.
I read that at the end because I went through the grade 8 test, and I went through quickly some of the others just to get a feel for what these examples were. And when I saw that at the end, I stopped and said to myself, now, who is this test administrator that can add 15 extra points? Where are the criteria for what he adds? Is this a way to raise kids' scores for some reason? Raise some of them a little bit, raise others a whole lot, and do something like the Wizard of Oz behind the screen and nobody even knows? Is anyone going to know that the test administrator, whoever that person
did the raising,
has raised scores?
Is there an
and
asterisk?
why?
Yeah,
that tells you we don't know.
That it got boosted?
But I couldn't find any information yet. Now, maybe Dr. Wagner can explain who test administrator, with capital letters, test administrator, is it the Wizard of Oz? We don't know who's going to be raising kids' scores or doing something with their scores, and the rest of us will never know.
Well, hopefully we'll find out. We're going to have them in here in studio tomorrow, and I knew that you would raise enough questions that I could possibly have them in here for the entire hour. But as we wrap up here, Doctor, where do we stand in 2017? And you're concerned, and Common Core, it sounds like you're coring something, and you're...
Common Core is control of the local public school system by people who want to control other people's children. But the local taxpayers and parents have almost no say at all. And yet we have been told over and over again by the people who passed, it's called ESSA, E-S-S-A, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the successor to No Child Left Behind, just to get in that acronym. But we've been told over and over again that it's going to reduce federal control and put more control back at the state and local level. Well, it seems to be putting control into the State Department of Education, but they're mostly appointed people. I know them because I worked with them in Massachusetts. The elected people are your local elected school board and your state legislature. And did they hold hearings? I didn't know here that there were even any hearings held here in Rhode Island.
About the move to
about
MCAS 2.0.
Adopting MCAS 2.0. Where were hearings, public hearings, so parents could ask questions, witnesses could testify. I've testified in 35 different states since 2010. I don't know. Maybe Rhode Island politics is different from Massachusetts politics or what goes on in many other states, where they do want people to understand what is happening to their children, who's controlling them. But in this case, you've got a Department of Ed that simply adopted a test that nobody knows anything about.
Well, we're going to talk to Dr. Wagner more about it tomorrow, but as I said, I knew you'd raise a number of questions for folks to just be cognizant of, whether you're concerned about the state of public education, whether you've got kids in the public schools, or want to know more about the Common Core. Clearly a lot more questions to be asked about the move from Park to MCAS 2.0, and we'll be asking Dr. Wagner tomorrow, and I'm sure you and I will be talking soon, Dr. Stotsky, so I appreciate your coming into the studio here today And we'll talk shortly.
Be very happy to come from Boston to Providence.
All the way down from Brookline. Or you can Skype in. I appreciate your coming into the studio.
Anytime.
Wish you a safe trip back. Okay.
Thank you.
I'll let you go around the corner.